In 1992, a horrific crime shook Waukegan, Illinois. 11-year-old Holly Staker was brutally raped and murdered while babysitting.
This is one of the more brutal crimes that anyone could imagine. Holly Staker was an 11-year-old child. She was babysitting children. She was stabbed 27 times. It was horrible.
The police needed a suspect, and they found one in 19-year-old Juan Rivera. But what followed was not justice. It was a 20-year nightmare of coercion, false confessions, and a system that failed an innocent man. Welcome to Grim Riddles Crime Stories. Viewer discretion is advised. Juan Rivera was an easy target. He was a high school dropout with a minor burglary conviction, and he wore an ankle monitor at the time of the crime. But there was no physical evidence tying him to Holly's murder. No fingerprints, no DNA, no reliable witnesses. So how did he end up convicted not once but 3 times?
It's like so many wrongful convictions that we've seen. First, there's a brutal crime. The case grows cold. Then a jailhouse informant comes forward and tells the police that Juan Rivera knew something about the crime. The police are under incredible pressure. They interrogate Juan Rivera. They know the fastest way to convict him and get him charged is to get him to confess.
Juan grew up between the South Bronx and Puerto Rico, a kid who had big dreams but very little direction. A special education student with an IQ of 79, he struggled with reading and understanding complex language. Just 19, he was trying to start over in Waukegan, but his past and his vulnerabilities made him a perfect scapegoat. Juan had a history of mental illness. During his interrogation, he was so distressed he banged his head against a cell wall. A nurse described him as not in touch with reality, yet police pressed on, exploiting his fragile state. For 4 days, police interrogated Juan relentlessly, using the controversial read technique, a method known to pressure false confessions. After a grueling 24-hour session with barely any sleep, Juan, disoriented and medicated, signed 2 confessions he later said he didn't even remember making.
I think the concept that somebody would falsely confess to a serious crime, it's counterintuitive.
Others will tell you that the time for a proper interrogation is measured in hours, not days. That if one cannot get somebody to confess voluntarily within a few hours, then beyond that we get to enter the realm of coercive interrogation, where confessions that ensue are inherently less reliable. In Juan Rivera's case, the police interrogated him hour after hour after hour, and he knew nothing and said nothing about the case. It was only later, when he, by all accounts, went into an emotional breakdown from the pressure of the interrogation, that he became willing to parrot back to the police anything and everything that they asked him to say.
What we were able to do is we were able to go back and look at that confession. There was not anything in that confession that was what we call original knowledge or original information. And it's something that the police did not already know. There was not one thing. And he got lots of the facts wrong. And all of the details in this confession, and it was a very detailed confession, had come from these police reports from the very detectives who had taken this confession.
This case was extremely weak from the beginning. There was a great deal of physical evidence. There was blood, there was hair, there was semen, there were fingerprints, none of it tying Juan Rivera to the crime. Not only was there no physical evidence, but there were no witnesses, and there was nothing in Juan's background to indicate that he'd have a propensity for committing violence or any kind of violence. The only thing they had was a confession.
And yet, these shaky confessions became the cornerstone of his convictions.
I was in disbelief. At the time when they convicted me the first time, my demeanor was very aggressive towards any and everyone that approached me. So when I was sentenced to natural life and they took me back to segregation where I was housed in, I automatically got into a fight with an officer. I broke a door. So, I mean, to tell you how I felt, well, I guess my actions speak louder than words. I was very angry. Being in prison surrounded by individuals that are serial killers, mass murderers, I mean, arsonists, extortionists, I mean, not knowing what prison is like to going into an environment that is unnatural to you is very difficult. So, I mean, I don't know how to explain it. I mean, it's hell. I mean, there's no other way to explain how it is to be in prison. It's hell. I was stabbed twice because of this case. Prison does not allow any individual to serve time for raping or murdering any child, whether it be male or female. So yes, while I was in prison, I got beat up a few times. I got stabbed twice, went hungry a couple of times. So yes, I went through a lot while I was in prison.
Juan faced 3 trials, each riddled with errors. In 1993, the prosecution leaned on his confession and questionable jailhouse informants, one of whom tried to sell his story to a newspaper. The jury convicted Juan, but the conviction was overturned for judicial errors. In 1998, a second trial brought new testimony from a child witness only 2 years old at the time of the crime. Despite doubts about her memory, Juan was convicted again.
Absent that plausible actual other suspect, the Rivera people had a very high hurdle to reach, which is they put on a case which asked jurors to believe, well, do you believe these fine, brave and true police officers who tell you that, yeah, this guy Juan Rivera unburdened himself of all this information right in the middle of the night, and he told us all about this crime, including things that only the killer would have known? Or are you going to believe this guy Juan Rivera? And even though the DNA didn't match, even though the whole story of his involvement was pretty far-fetched, you had to believe his story, or you had to believe the police. And in cases like that, we've seen over and over again that jurors are willing to believe whatever the police tell them.
Then, in 2004, a game changer. DNA evidence excluded Juan as the source of semen found on Holly's body.
When the DNA results came in showing that Juan Rivera was absolutely not the person who was responsible for the rape of Holly Staker, everybody assumed that that was the end of the case. This was the classic exoneration.
But Lake County prosecutors didn't stop there. They retried Juan in 2009, claiming the 11-year-old victim had consensual intimate relations with someone else, a theory the courts later called highly improbable.
When the case came to trial in 2009, the prosecution had a problem. They had to explain somehow to the jury how Juan could be guilty despite the DNA exclusion. Well, they came up with 2 theories. One was that the DNA sample, had somehow been contaminated. That was provably false. The DNA came from sperm heads, and you can't change the DNA of a sperm head by contaminating the sample. The second theory was even more preposterous.
One of the most outrageous aspects of this case is that the prosecution argued without any evidence whatsoever that this 11-year-old child was having consensual sex. According to the prosecution, the semen that was recovered from her body was from a prior encounter that they claim happened with someone that they cannot name earlier in the day or the day before.
They even introduced gym shoes supposedly stained with Holly's blood, shoes that didn't exist at the time of the murder.
The problem that advocates for Juan Rivera have is that although there is DNA evidence in the victim that had that pointed away from Juan Rivera, that excluded him as her, they did not know to whom that belonged, and so the prosecution is able to spin some fanciful and in my mind, repellent theory that this 11-year-old girl had with somebody else earlier in the day.
Now, most people have a hard time understanding why a person would confess to a crime he or she didn't commit, particularly a crime like this one. But the more we study wrongful convictions, the more we appreciate how common false confessions are, which is why, in a case such as this, when the confession was dubious to begin with, and you have hard science pointing away from the defendant, common sense dictates that you've got the wrong guy. For 20 years now, a vicious killer has remained at large, while Juan Rivera has languished in prison for a crime he didn't commit. There was no physical evidence linking him to it. There was no witness. There was no violence in his past, and yet he was convicted. If reasonable doubt means anything, this conviction can't stand, and the police need to reopen the investigation and search for the person who left that semen in Holly Staker's body.
His name is Henry D., which he was the cellmate of my brother now. And this is an individual that's been incarcerated for, I believe, 45, 46 years now. And he stated to me that I'm always going around claiming that I'm innocent, but that my actions are not going to allow me to go home. Of course, like as I stated, I was very angry and I was lashing out at individuals. So when he stated this to me, that kind of pulled me back and I started reassessing myself. Is this the lifestyle that I'm going to live, or am I going to look for something better? So I started reading books, educating myself, learning proper grammar, which I still don't have it, but I'm attempting to it. I study a lot of religion. I studied the world's religion. I studied the Hebrew language, the Arabic language. I just started educating myself. I don't know, I guess to say that how I lived in there was, I could only take care of myself because they were not.
In 2011, the Illinois Appellate Court delivered justice. They overturned Juan's third conviction, declaring no rational jury could find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They barred a fourth trial, citing double jeopardy. On January the 6th, 2012, after nearly 20 years, Juan Rivera walked free.
Let's go home. It's time to go home. Moment, Rivera will tell you life has been anything but easy.
I've been out a little over 5 years and I still cannot go out in public. You know, like in the big crowd, I get nervous, I start sweating, I go into panic attacks. So, I mean, it's still a process. And I still get death threats. People, you know, are very ignorant and approach me.
Tonight, life after prison for a man who spent years behind bars for the high-profile murder of a suburban girl. Juan Rivera was eventually cleared of that crime and received millions of dollars that he is now using to give back.
And he is still close to one person who got to know him well while he was in prison. Barber instructor Bobby Madison, a correctional officer there.
He had the right texture hair, and he was working in the kitchen. And I asked him if he wanted to come and let me cut his hair. I wanted to show the new students that I had how to cut his hair.
I just saw the passion that he had in giving back. I figured, you know, I could do that.
So with part of that multi-million-dollar settlement, Rivera gave Madison $300,000, and together, they've started Legacy Barber College on Chicago's South Side. This state-of-the-art facility has conference rooms, a lounge, a store where students can learn to sell products, and every student will have their own station and tablet computer.
How many people come to, as I say, the South Side, you know, to the ghetto to give less fortunate individuals an opportunity, you know, whether they have committed crimes or not. I felt that this would have been a perfect opportunity to show that, you know, we can give back.
Juan's case exposes deep flaws in our justice system: coercive interrogations, prosecutorial overreach, and a refusal to admit mistakes. The real killer in Holly Staker's case remains at large. DNA from her murder matched another crime, but no one has been held accountable. Juan's story is a call to action, to demand reforms, ban coercive interrogation techniques, ensure fair trials, and hold prosecutors accountable. Please share Juan's story and support organisations like the Innocence Project and the Centre on Wrongful Convictions. Together, we can prevent another 20 years stolen.